Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and if there's one specific legend that I really love is the Arthurian legend. If anything, just the other day I was playing this video game, Knight of the Round, on my gaming channel Metatron's Protectorate, link in the description below. If you're not subscribed, you are missing out, although given it was a Lancelot run, but I might do a King Arthur run very soon. Link in the description. Don't be a muppet. However, today we are checking out History Hit because 6 days ago they posted a video titled Historian Answers the Most Asked Questions About King Arthur. I mean, wow. Without further ado, let's jump right into it.
In still more versions of the legend, he's like a bit of a harasser and won't leave her alone. They capture the imagination, they've got the supernatural, they've got big fights. She cheats on Arthur with his son Mordred and agrees to marry him whilst Arthur's away fighting. Hi, I'm Hetta Howes. I'm a senior lecturer in medieval literature at City St George's, University of London. I'm an expert in medieval literature and history, and I'm here with History Hit today to see if I can answer Google's most popular questions about King Arthur. So we can put me to the test.
Alright, is it a hit or a miss, History Hit? Love the little sword there. She seems lovely, but we'll have to see. We'll judge by what she says.
Was King Arthur real? Start with the biggest question and the hardest one to answer in any kind of discussion of King Arthur. The answer is probably no. There's lots of reason to believe that Arthur was pretty much a fictional character. However,
yeah, before she goes into the deep however, I would like to say, I mean, it's a fantasy legend. I do believe, though, that it might be based on some truth. And I think that that's something that happens with a lot of legends and a lot of stories and a lot of tales that we get from the past, that sometimes, yes, they're embellished. Yes, they add a lot of stuff. I mean, it's not like I'm actually believing that there was a wizard by the name of Merlin who was actually able to cast spells. With that being said, oftentimes there is a layer of truth. And then from something perhaps even ancient at times, perhaps not the case here, but it's possible that a high medieval tale had as a foundation an early medieval real historical person.
we do get some references to him in early, particularly Welsh chronicles, history chronicles. So the first time Arthur is mentioned by name in a history chronicle is by a guy called Nennius, a Welsh monk writing in the 800s. He writes a history of Britain, and he mentions a man called Arturus or Arthur. And this guy is a warlord, he fights in battles, but we don't really get much else. And the fact that a predecessor of Nennius called Gildas, who writes a lot of history from the time King Arthur is placed, doesn't mention Arthur is a little bit suspect. Bede also doesn't mention Arthur. After Nennius was writing, we do get sort of various more and more references to King Arthur, which are fleshed out in more and more prominence.
Hey, look at all these gentlemen with their flowy hair. I mean, it's still short compared to mine, but at least I feel like I belong.
So Geoffrey of Monmouth writes a history of the kings of Britain, and he gives this character Arthur his sort of king status, he gives him more backstory, and this snowballs and becomes the Arthurian legends we know and love today. But in terms of sort of definitive historical evidence of a man called King Arthur who was a king at all, at the time period that King Arthur is normally placed, we don't really have any evidence of that. All right, second question, who was King Arthur? So whether King Arthur was real or not, there's some sort of particular ideas about King Arthur that we find in lots of different sources. So King Arthur was the son of Uther Pendragon and a woman called Igraine. His parentage is a little bit dodgy. So according to the legend, we've got this king or warlord, I should say, in the 5th or 6th centuries called Uther Pendragon, and he falls completely in love with a woman called Igraine who is married to somebody else, the Duke of Cornwall. Now Merlin, who is another character in Arthurian legend, he works with Uther to disguise Uther's appearance so Uther looks like his enemy, and Igraine sleeps with him thinking that it's her husband, and thus Arthur is conceived. So some slightly unfortunate parentage for Arthur. In almost all the early references we get to Arthur, he exists in around the sort of 5th or 6th centuries, in this space of time that we know actually very little about in history, when the Roman Empire has withdrawn from Britain and there's a lot of infighting, sort of Saxons coming in, various different battles, and we don't know a lot about this time period. And a lot of people think that actually Arthur was inserted into this time period because it was so shrouded in mystery and complexity, and it's sort of a good story to fill in that gap.
It is a good possibility, and we have to take it into account. It is also possible that he did exist, but once again, just like we don't have a lot of historical information on this period, the evidence was also gone. So I don't really completely dismiss, neither does she, but in fact I'm agreeing with her, but I don't completely dismiss the possibility that eventually we will find something and we'll be like, okay, that's it. This definitively prove that King Arthur was based on a real historical king by the name of Arthur. It could happen. It could be a case.
Always a great fighter, so he fights off quite famously the Saxons. He fights in Rome. He almost marches on Rome in one of the legends. And he is famous for sort of bringing Britain together, but also carving out an empire overseas. He actually only becomes King Arthur in a text by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So in the earlier mentions, he's a warlord, right. But Geoffrey of Monmouth famously makes him a king, probably to appeal to his readership, who would have understood the idea of a king a little bit better. What was King Arthur king of? So Camelot. King Arthur is king of Britain in the legend. So he's king of sort of England, Wales, Scotland, parts of Ireland. He also, according to some of the legends, actually is king of parts of overseas. So he takes over, for example, Gaul in the Roman Empire. The idea is that King Arthur wants to make his kingdom as great and as expansive as possible. At the time that a lot of these legends are being written, the idea of a good king was someone who could expand and conquer, right. Colonize basically. So King Arthur is king of Britain, but also elsewhere. However, he becomes particularly associated in later legends, sometimes with England by English writers. Originally, he has a lot of associations with Wales. Yeah. So the first few writers that mention him are actually Welsh chroniclers. And even now today in Wales, there's a lot of different places that are supposedly linked with King Arthur. Caerleon in Wales is supposed to be where Camelot was, his sort of stronghold, his...
Man, that's a fascinating thought. All right, so we've got Caerleon, I have no idea how to pronounce it. We've got a Wikipedia page and even a Caerleon Roman fortress and baths Wikipedia dedicated page. And then, of course, Britannica and whatnot. And then if I click on images, wow. I mean, if you showed me this and you said, we are thinking maybe this could be somewhere where historical Camelot could have been. Of course, I'm going to need evidence. But I have to say, it is, yeah, I mean, it could be. Let me see the fort. I really love how green Wales, England, Britain is. What I don't love is the amount of rain required for it to be that green. Location within Newport. I mean, as you know, I'm not a huge fan of Wikipedia usually, but for a cursory glance, at least of where the heck it is. All right, great. Love it.
Castle in the hub of his kingdom.
When we look back at history, we often focus on the big picture events. But what we don't always see are the personal struggles, the moments of doubt and fear, and the need for support that shaped those stories. And that's why we're so excited to share the paid partner of today's video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is an...
BetterHelp, are they still getting sponsorships after the whole situation that happened? Goodness gracious. I already know what I'm going to see in the comments. I personally didn't have a great experience with BetterHelp, so I'm not going to get sponsorships from it.
How do we know about King Arthur? We are very lucky if Arthur were real, in that we actually have quite a lot of sources about King Arthur. The validity of those sources is a different question.
Of course.
But the best way to think about it is there's sort of two traditions or two strands of sources about King Arthur. So you have your history chronicles and you have what we call romance narratives. So we'll start with the
Historia Regum Britanniae. Regum?
History chronicles. History chronicles things like Geoffrey of Monmouth's Kings of Britain, written in all kinds of different languages, sometimes Latin, sometimes Welsh, sometimes English, that tell the story of how Britain came to be and actually often try and associate the history of Britain with classical legends, so the fall of Troy, the Roman Empire, things like that. The history chronicles purport to be true. So they are saying there was a man called Arthur, he was real, let me tell you about him. However, history in medieval times we have to always take with a pinch of salt. These days when we talk about history, we normally at least try and be very objective. Of course, everybody's biased, but...
Yeah, depending on who you ask, because... yeah, I mean, sure, that's how it should be. And that's what I always purport. It's what I push, academic neutrality, trying to be as unbiased as possible within the limitations of the human mind, and then just tell it how it is. But a lot of today's academia, unfortunately, is instead pushing political nonsense, and that's why I come into the picture as their nemesis, since there are people that are afraid of the possible backlash that can happen when you call out a fake historian. At that point, I would prefer a medieval historian, to be honest. At that point, I'd take a medieval historian over a modern historian who pretends to be so enlightened modernly, and then all they do is twist the facts, hide the things that are not good for them, and then push politics. It's nonsense. I'm not attacking her. I think we agree on what real historians are supposed to be today.
But we're trying to give the best possible representation of facts.
Yes,
this was not
absolutely.
always the aim of medieval history, quite the opposite. In fact, Geoffrey of Monmouth is one of the most well-known sources for King Arthur. So a contemporary of Geoffrey of Monmouth, called Gerard of Wales, tells a story of a possessed man, and he says that if this possessed man laid down and put the Gospels on his chest, all the devils would leave his body. But were someone to put Geoffrey of Monmouth's history of the kings of Britain on this man's chest, all the devils would come back. So he basically said that what Geoffrey of Monmouth was writing was nonsense. Whether this was rivalry or whatever else, we don't know. So we've got the history tradition, which we have to take with a little bit of a pinch of salt. The writers are claiming that what they're saying is factual. Some of the characters that appear in it are verifiable, others not so much. Then we have another tradition, the Romance tradition, and the two kind of start to coincide and then go off in different directions. The Romance tradition ends up becoming much more associated with France. For example, writers like Chrétien de Troyes in the 13th century. Romance doesn't mean love in this time period. It means a genre that is interested in stories of knights, damsels in distress, often love stories too, perhaps a supernatural. So in those kinds of stories, we get a lot more fleshing out of legend about King Arthur. That's where we get stories about sort of fighting giants, or more of the backstory of his marriage to Guinevere, for example. We also get a lot of spin-offs about many of his knights. But yeah.
Okay, very interesting. So one thing that I wanted to add to the point that she stressed, the idea of doesn't matter what a medieval historian says is a fact, we should still go and check and try to see, perhaps when you say go and check, of course you need to look for perhaps archaeological evidence, layers of archaeological evidence. A material good can actually provide verification and substantiate some of the claims made by the historian. Also see if other historians also say that, also see if there are surrounding cultures that mention the same thing, and then add literary tradition. Do they also say the same thing? Iconography. Do we have representations in art, statuary, stelae and whatnot that sort of point to the same conclusions? So yeah, we should do all of that with a medieval historian. So should we with a classical historian. And let me tell you, so will future historians do with our historians, because we are in no position to say that what we do now is better than what they did back then, simply because, once again, as I mentioned, modern academia is often, not always, a complete, utter joke. Now, if you are watching this, an academic, you teach at a university, or maybe you have an advanced degree, don't feel attacked if that's not you. If you're like, well, I take offense to that because I'm not like that, I'm very unbiased and I try to do my work and I'm professional, great, I'm not talking about you then. So don't get offended. And if you do get offended and think, well, I have a reason because I need to push this message and political this and political that, then yes, I'm talking about you. Please do take offense. So I do make that distinction.
Yeah, we essentially have history, romance, and then some other bits in between.
Good.
Next question.
Next.
Where does the Arthurian legend come from? Again, because the sources are so multiple and complex in their relationship with one another, this is a difficult question to answer. The first reference to Arthur is from this Welsh chronicle, history chronicle, Nennius. It's then built up by writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth in particular, but also writers like Thomas Malory in the 15th century. And then there's sort of spin-offs in other countries. So in France, the Arthurian legends and romance traditions really flourish, the most famous writer being Chrétien de Troyes in the 13th century. And all of them are kind of working from these sort of little mentions of Arthur in early sources, and then they sort of balloon or snowball out.
Yes, that's when it becomes actual literature, and which is wonderful, by the way, but of course we have to be able to separate that. She's great so far, I would like to underline. I really like her presentation style. She seems to really know what she's talking about. So very nice. Let me have a look at what we've got. So, was King Arthur Welsh? Was King Arthur a Saxon? Well, I remember in the stories it says that he was fighting the Saxons, so I would say no. How did King Arthur pull the sword from the stone with his hand? What's the most famous King Arthur story? Merlin. What was King Arthur's round table? It was the table built by circumference. Okay, we've got some really, really good ones. We're not going to watch the whole thing as always, but I do like the order in which they are placed.
In interesting ways. And I think what's so interesting about Arthurian legend is that so many different places want to lay claim to it. So Wales want to lay claim to it, the Normans want to lay claim to it, the Bretons want to lay claim to it, France wants to lay claim to it. There's even some questions nowadays, it was Arthur from Scotland. So originally the first references are Welsh, but then lots of people try and get involved with the legend too.
Of course.
Ah yes, was King Arthur Welsh? To be honest, no matter which way you think about it, yes, King Arthur at least was associated with Wales more strongly than with anywhere else, at least originally. So those early mentions in history chronicles, you know, if someone says, was King Arthur real? We tend to go back to Nennius, we go back to Geoffrey of Monmouth, they're from Wales. And other characters that are quite big in the Arthur corpus are coming from Welsh tradition as well. So Merlin is the advisor to King Arthur, and he's coming out of fables and folklore that are also coming from Wales. And Camelot, which is one of the sort of biggest settings from Arthurian legend, may well have been in Wales. Does King Arthur identify in legends as Welsh? No. But are his stories coming out of Wales a lot of the time? Yes, absolutely. Next question.
And the Welsh have got a red dragon on their flag. What more evidence you want?
Was King Arthur a Saxon? So to answer that question, probably worth saying what was a Saxon. So Saxons were a Germanic peoples that came over to Britain around sort of the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yes.
For a long time, we've tended to think about...
Good. She's going into the how we change. Yeah. Good. I like her approach a lot, very methodical. So what she's going to say now is that we had an older version interpretation of the idea of massive invasions and basically population reassignment, massive population clusters that pushed indigenous people or locals completely out and replaced them. That has been changed. We don't think that anymore. Historians don't think that anymore. And it's more... that these were gradual with smaller numbers that still had a massive impact and then over time and then mingled with the populations and created a little bit of a difference in the strata between the upper class and the lower class. A bit similar to what happens later with the Normans. But of course the expert is going to go in even further details, so let's listen to her. I'll try not to interrupt her in this section.
Saxons as a sort of invading force, and in fact Geoffrey of Monmouth talks about them wanting to exterminate the race of Britain. It seems now that there is actually very little historical or archaeological evidence to suggest this kind of invasion on any scale. It more seems to have been a slow, gradual migration, cultural assimilation. Either way, King Arthur was definitely not a Saxon, because in a lot of the legends he is fighting off the Saxons.
Correct.
He is kind of getting the Saxons away from the throne, from Britain, and sort of solidifying Britain against the Saxons. But I think this tells us more about 12th century writers, 13th century writers, 14th century writers than it does about what was actually happening in the 5th or 6th centuries. Someone like Geoffrey of Monmouth is trying to establish King Arthur as a unifier of Britain, associating him with particularly English or Welsh heritage, and sort of the enemy that is held up in these legends is the Saxons. So he was certainly not a Saxon, he was fighting them most of the time, and usually winning.
Very good. Excellent presentation. I want to point something out. If you noticed, of course, the editor, this is not the professor doing it, but the editor is using a lot of images that we have and a lot of paintings. Some are like contemporary representations, others, some are medieval, some are modern, but they come from whatever stories. What's interesting is that whenever we imagine King Arthur and Lancelot, particularly if they are dressed in military attire, so they're in armor, it's either we imagine them in full plate armor, which would really be 1,000 years anachronistic, because if the real King Arthur was from the 5th century, let's imagine for a moment, full plate armor, the way it's represented is clearly 15th century, so it's like 900 years, no, 1,000 years in fact, of difference. So he wouldn't be wearing plate armor. Although then again, I love it when they do it. So that's one of those forms of anachronism that I'm more than happy to accept if it's a video game or a movie, but that's often what happens. But in some of the images that we saw, sometimes he was dressed up in like 12th century knightly attire. So he was wearing mail, but then he had a great helm that was clearly a 12th century type of great helm, and that is also anachronistic. So how should we imagine him? We should imagine him, wearing mail. Mail is fine. 5th century, though, I wouldn't imagine mail that goes and extends all the way down to the wrist and then past and even into mittens. Maybe that's a bit much, but yeah, a mail shirt. I would give him a mail shirt, and then I would give him maybe one of the prototypes of the earliest types of bucket helms, but more likely maybe give him a conical or a helmet, something like that. But I understand it's a lot less epic looking, so once again, I'm more than happy to see him dressed in either 12th century or 15th century armor.
How did King Arthur pull the sword from the stone?
Yes.
So I think when you picture Arthurian legend, one of the biggest visual images you probably have in your head is Arthur pulling the sword from the stone. It has led to so many different iterations, adaptations, beautiful artwork. It's a really profound image of someone not knowing what their destiny is and finding out in a sort of innovative way. Interestingly, in the legends of King Arthur, there are in fact 2 different swords. So a lot of people, when they hear sword in the stone, are thinking of the sword Excalibur.
No, I think Excalibur comes from the lake with the lady of the lake, right?
Arthur did have a sword called Excalibur given to him by the lady in the lake, but the sword from the stone was not Excalibur. That was a different sword. They do become conflated in some legends, but originally 2 different swords. The sword from the stone specifically is a sword that will tell the people of Britain who the next king should be. So in the Chronicles, Uther Pendragon, Arthur's father, has been killed by the Saxons, and there's a question of who's going to be king next. Now, Arthur is Uther Pendragon's son, but was squirreled away by Merlin to keep him safe as the rightful heir. So Arthur is growing up unaware that he is the son of Igraine and Uther Pendragon. He is a squire to a knight called Sir Kay and his father, Sir Hector. According to the stories, Merlin, once Uther has died, says, right, we need to establish the next heir to the throne, and he produces a sword in a stone. And where this sword came from is shrouded in mystery. It just sort of appears. Perhaps Merlin put the sword in, we don't know. But Merlin says whoever pulls the sword from the stone will be the right king of England. Arthur goes along with Kay and Hector. He sees that Kay, his brother, who he's squire to, doesn't have a sword, so he goes to get him one. He picks up the one from the stone, not having any idea about this story. He's a young boy, he's not heard any of the stories. Takes the sword to Kay, and everyone's like, hang on a minute, Arthur, where did you get this sword from? Do you know what this means? And he's like, oh, I just got it from that stone over there. They get to take it back, pull it out again, and of course this means that Arthur is rightful king. And in Geoffrey of Monmouth, the description straight after this is immediately of what a wonderful king Arthur was. So generous, so great.
I mean, I know we're all doing this, so we might as well just admit it to the camera right now. We are all thinking of the Disney one, aren't we? The Disney iteration of the story of, the Arthurian legend still remains, even though I'm not a huge fan of Disney anymore, but that one remains a really good one. I think it would be something I would show a kid of mine, even if it's would be considered super old media. It's just such a beautiful way. And Merlin is awesome.
Such a great leader and fighter. So right from the moment he pulls the sword from the stone, his sort of kingship career begins. Next question. What's the most famous King Arthur story? Depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
I think there's a few candidates to answer this question. One that immediately pops into my mind is the story of the Holy Grail, just again because it lives so much in our cultural memory. Indiana Jones, for example, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The idea being that there's this relic, this icon associated with Jesus Christ. Remember, Arthur is a sort of Christian king in a lot of the legends. Arthur wants his knights to go and get the Holy Grail, to find the Holy Grail and bring it back to Camelot, so that's one possibility. But I think also a lot of the spin-offs become quite famous. Stories that don't really involve Arthur that much at all. So a really popular one, or we think it was probably quite popular in the Middle Ages, is Gawain and the Green Knight, where one of the knights, Gawain, goes on a quest and he meets this sort of green monster, green giant, as it were. And then I think also the love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, which brings down the Round Table, is pretty famous as well. This idea that Arthur's most loyal favourite knight fell in love with Arthur's queen, Guinevere. They fell in love. And when that relationship was discovered, the Round Table starts to fall. But I mean, they're all great stories. So many possibilities. If you were to ask me what's my favourite King Arthur story, it's actually one written by a woman. So usually Arthurian legends are written by male writers or anonymous or transmit orally. But there was a French writer called Marie de France, who wrote a number of different sort of kind of fables. And one of them is set in the Arthurian court of Camelot. In her story, Arthur doesn't come across well at all. Her story is called Lanval. It's about one of Arthur's knights who's come across from a different country, sort of a stranger in a strange land. And Arthur sort of forgets about him. He forgets to give him any money or look after him. All the other knights are a bit jealous of Lanval. And this kind of leads on to great things for Lanval. Lanval meets a beautiful fairy woman and she takes him under her wing, and Lanval goes on to have a completely different story. But I like this version because it's a different kind of Arthur to the one we normally see. Arthur's well-meaning, but he's neglectful. And I also think there's a very interesting representation of Guinevere in this story. So usually Guinevere is sort of a very pure, good, beautiful woman, doesn't get a lot of airtime unless she's kind of being abducted and rescued. In Marie's story, she's quite petty and jealous, and she sort of turns the narrative in that way. So I think it's an interesting story because we would expect perhaps Marie to make Guinevere a bit of a heroine, but she kind of does the opposite. Wow. Next question.
Yeah, that could be. Okay, so I didn't read that, but it could be interesting to read it just to see how, because of how she explained it. Very interesting. Let's do one more, but let's choose it. So Merlin, let's have a look at this Round Table. Yeah, let's check out the Round Table, and then I would refer you to click the link in the description or in the pinned comment to go finish the video and watch all of the other sections. Let's check it out.
What was King Arthur's Round Table? So the Round Table, again, is one of those really visual elements of the King Arthur legends.
Look at the colours.
In most retellings, we'll get some nod to the Round Table.
Yep.
Originally, it seems to have been part of the sort of oral storytelling tradition around King Arthur. And in its first iterations, it's actually Arthur's dad, Uther Pendragon, that sets up the Round Table, although Arthur keeps it around. In later legends, it becomes associated exclusively with Arthur. Arthur is the one who sets up the Round Table. So what is it? Well, it does what it says on the tin. It's a round table. Why is that important? Because it means no one is prioritized over anyone else. If you're sat around a round table, everybody is equal. There's no head of the table, there's no bottom of the table. It essentially irons out any kind of inequalities. So what we tend to get in mentions of Arthur's Round Table is this emphasis on him wanting everyone to feel like they have a seat at the table, everyone's voice will be heard, an egalitarian, almost democratic society. Yes, he's still the king, he still is in charge, but...
Yeah, I wouldn't call it democratic at all, Professor, but that's just me.
Everybody is sort of a knight and everyone is respected. So the first real mention of it properly in that sense is from a writer called Was, a French writer in the 1100s.
Nice.
And he talks about it in much that sense, but also in quite a sense of the empire and Europe. There's sort of people from all over Europe sitting at the table, this idea that Arthur is drawing in not only people from his own country, but also...
they're having some proper feasts every time I'm seeing a chicken. So nice. And bread. Look, everyone has got his own bread. We've got... Imagine some red wine, perhaps, to go with that.
This idea that Arthur is drawing in not only people from his own country, but also he's a bit of a statesman as well, politically. So we have an English writer called Layman, and he sort of expounds on this legend, this sort of late 12th, early 13th century, by having the establishment of the Round Table, putting an end to a fight amongst some barons and nobility in Arthur's court. So everybody's fighting about who's more important than who. And he's like, I'm sick of this, let's have a round table. So that's the kind of backstory of the Round Table.
Fantastic. She did a fantastic job. Okay, so I liked this very much. I think it was great. And if you do, please check it out. Leave a comment, give him a view, give him a like, and all the good stuff. But thank you so much for watching. I think we had a good time today. And do not forget to go and check out my gaming channel, because I will be playing as King Arthur very soon, but I play a lot of other games, a lot of which I think you would love, such as like Warhammer games and other like retro and modern. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. Goodbye.